I'm thrilled to be here with Tracey Taylor at Goodwood Aerodrome. Just 14 days ago, Tracey landed here after an epic journey across Africa in an open cockpit Boeing Stearman vintage aircraft. She was recreating the epic trip that Lady Mary Heath took in 1928. She's covered 9,825 miles, 38 legs across about 2 months, overcoming all sorts of adversity from weather through to bureaucracy. Delighted to be talking to her about her inspiration, the story and her incredible achievement. Tracey, you were born in the UK, grew up in Canada. When was your interest in aviation and more specifically vintage aircraft peaked?
I think I was always interested in flight, whether it was the flight of birds or, and I think intrinsically people are, aren't they? It's just such a fascinating thing. But my first experience of aviation was in Canada when I was very young. So my father was a journalist and had a great interest in aeroplanes and cars, etc. So he took us to the odd air show. And then later when we'd moved back to England, I suppose I was reading about it at an early stage and then saw that film, those magnificent men in their flying machines. So I was interested in early flight as just it's just such an inspirational thing. I never thought I would fly, but I had my first flying lesson at 16 when I went back to Canada with my twin sister for a summer. And then when I was working and then living in New Zealand, I then started in earnest with flight lessons and worked through, a private license, a commercial license, and then I instructed. But very early on in that process, I had the chance to fly old aeroplanes, and then it just became a real passion.
Very, very inspiring. I suppose with all the modern, highly technical aircraft that are available, you obviously have a great passion for vintage aircraft and flying those. Why is it that the vintage aircraft that you love?
Well, firstly, they look great. I just think that's the most exciting, beautiful thing I've ever seen. So that's what fired me up in the first instance. But I just love old mechanical, old machines. They're sort of something basic, honest, accessible. I do use technology in this. I have a Garmin 430, so I'm using some modern navigation in it, and that made my life a lot easier. So in that respect, I had it a lot easier than Mary Heath. But that's my only concession, really. I like the challenge of vintage aeroplanes. That's all I fly, and that's all I was ever going to fly up Africa.
So conceivably, because you love them so much, almost that challenge is something less of a challenge perhaps to other people. Moving on to the trip and the challenge there, I was interested to read about how you got funding. You sent a letter to the CEO of Artemis.
Well, I think it really captured their imagination, and I had seen one of their advertisements a year before I approached them. And it featured a 1930s flying boat, and it was all about the profit hunting and this. Again, it was a sort of old-fashioned adventure, and we're looking for opportunities off the beaten track, and it's all about range and endurance. And I just realised that I wrote to him, and I just said, and I found his name off the internet, and I just said, look, this probably sounds ridiculous, but I'm doing this mad adventure, this old-fashioned mad adventure up Africa, celebrating really the early pioneers. Particularly this one remarkable woman who's just been completely erased from history, but I'm having, a vintage aeroplane restored and customised for the flight, and it's the epitome of exactly what you're trying to represent in your projection and branding, etc. And within half an hour of me sending the email, his PA phoned me up and said, "When can you come in?"
What was it specifically about Lady Mary Heath's trip that you wanted to recreate? There were many pioneers and female aviators, but that particular one.
Well, I think she was one of the finest pilots of her day. I mean, she was a much better pilot than Amelia Earhart, for example, but Amelia is much more famous and remembered. But Mary Heath was slightly before that time, so she was one of the first female pilots. And, she was just such an achiever across the board, exceptional woman, highly intelligent, Olympic athlete, first commercial pilot's license holder in the UK, first woman to jump out of an aeroplane with a parachute. So she was one very brave, strong, outgoing, charismatic person. And here she did, and she also had this great affinity with Africa. So we have that in common. I've been infatuated with Africa practically my whole life. So there was this convergence of elements with it. So I was kind of steeped in all the pioneering aviators. You fly aeroplanes like this and you become interested in the people who flew them. And that interwar period where it was all the early development in civil aviation, so pioneering the air routes. And Africa was one of the main places they did that, of course, establishing the air routes through to our empire down in the Cape. Yeah. So the Cape to Cairo route, so again, I wanted to fly Cape to Cairo. At what point it crystallised was when it came together, when I heard of her flying. She was the first person to do it, and I thought, you know what, that's what I'm going to do. I spent 30 years flying old aeroplanes. I've been incredibly inspired by these people, but that's going to be my flight.
There's something about Africa, the romance, the magic, there's something almost mystical about it. But what was it for you? Conceivably, there were many places in the globe that you could have flown.
I think Africa is still the last frontier in real adventure, and it's dangerous, it's beautiful, it's exciting, it's magical. And I first went to Africa when I was 19, and I had a year there. So I was there travelling around, and then I travelled overland from Johannesburg back to London. So 5 months driving through parts that you couldn't even visit now, what was then Zaire, the Congo Basin. And these are some of the most perilous places on the planet, and then to go back 30 years later and to fly it was, for me personally, the return. It closes the loop. But it's everything I've ever been completely fired up by. But it was all, it was the convergence that makes this project for me such a brilliant enterprise. It's my whole life being obsessed with Africa, my whole life of flying vintage aeroplanes, my interest in the pioneering aviators, my interest in how women are changing Africa, my interest in the animals there, these wonderful exotic creatures and conservation, etc. So there's lots of elements to this story.
Yes. Talking about Africa specifically, and as you say, 30 years ago you were there, and that coming together, conceivably, when Lady Mary Heath flew there, it was still largely under European rule, which may have made it a little easier. Was the trip perhaps harder for you with the inherent safety risks and security elements that you had to consider?
I actually think it is harder to do now in a modern context, and that purely in terms of the bureaucracy, the borders, the security situations, the regimes that prevail in Africa. That's what makes it difficult. And of course, I'm flying a vintage aeroplane through that. I'm going into international airports, military airfields. She could get up at the crack of dawn, just push her aeroplane out of a hangar. She could throw motor fuel into it. She was flying one of the best sports planes of her day. She had lots of help on the ground with engineering, etc. So I think she had a much more sociable, dare I say, easier flight. I mean, the flying itself is not, there are perils attached to that, but intrinsically that was quite a straightforward side to it. It's what happens on the ground in Africa that makes it difficult.
I understand that at one stage you were banished to somewhere outside Khartoum in the Sudan. That must have been quite unnerving.
There were lots of issues once we left Kenya. So even going up through Entebbe into Uganda, it just got harder. And it's again because of the regimes that prevail. I got hauled over the coals in Entebbe. We then pushed on up to Juba in South Sudan, which of course has been in the news recently with, it's now a bloodbath. But flying into there, it was palpably tense. There's all these elements there. And we sort of arrive with the film crew. You're terribly vulnerable and you're terribly obvious. So I can't say it was a very nice experience. They're not very nice places to visit. They're very, very underdeveloped. There's horrific poverty. And of course, within 2 weeks of us being there, they're there shooting people in the roads, in the street. They're rounding up teenage boys and killing them. It's ethnic. It's genocide that's going on there.
And I would imagine it must have been quite frightening actually at times.
Well, the thing about Africa is it's unpredictable and it can just turn like that. And you just don't know what's going to happen. At one place in the south of Sudan, we landed. I basically had to call a technical landing in order to refuel it. So I was carrying jerry cans that I needed to put, an hour's worth of fuel in it in order to get up to Khartoum. And I was literally flying up the Nile, and then suddenly, you all get your passports confiscated, you're detained for 5 hours in sweltering heat, you're loaded into vehicles, you're taken off field, and this is where you don't know what's going to happen. And this is one of the places, it was right in the middle of the oil fields, and anything can happen in Africa. People do get shot at and murdered and so forth. So, it's nerve-wracking. But was I really frightened? No, because you never think the worst will happen. You always think, that you'll just get through it, and we did. And you just try to deal with every situation and just keep calm and reasonable, and you hope you're dealing with reasonable people.
With a cursory nod to the rules, shall we say, you flew over Victoria Falls. That must have been extraordinary. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, Victoria Falls was one of the highlights of the trip, really, but it was also in the middle of two control zones, so two different airports with overlapping control zones. And typically what they would do is they would layer the traffic up, so from the local operators and tour guides and, microlights, etc. So somebody like me would typically come in and they'd put you at something like 6,000 feet. So you'd be up at quite a high altitude above the falls. But one of the pilots from South Africa had said, look, if you manage to get there over lunchtime, it's often very quiet. There's nobody flying. And of course it was off season. The falls were at low ebb. And sure enough, I tooled into the area at about lunchtime and flew up the Zambezi Gorge. And you could see the sort of spume in the distance from the falls. Famously, it's known as Smoke Falls or something. And I just thought, I'm not flying this at 6,000 feet. And I wasn't actually talking to anybody at this point. And it was deserted, except for a few buzzards. So I swooped in low and did several circuits at just maybe 200 or 300 feet above the falls. So I had the flight of a lifetime. But of course, when I landed, I was told to go to the tower, and I had 3 hours of being told off, basically.
What was the best moment of your trip?
The best moment of the trip, I think, was landing at Nairobi, Wilson Airport, after, I think, probably the most brilliant day's flying I've ever had in my life. And it involved 4 different elements of air-to-air photography. The best piece was at flying over the Soda Lakes in formation with a Piper Cub, so I was formating on him, and my support aeroplane was filming both of us, and we were down at low level, maybe 10 feet above the water, with the flamingos going sideways underneath us, and then up through the Rift Valley, past live volcanoes, and up over the Ngong Hills into Nairobi, where we had a phenomenal reception.
And I suppose in contrast, what was the hardest? What was the more difficult?
The hardest part was, I think, Egypt. Having reached the Mediterranean coast, so effectively completed the Africa, the continent of Africa. So you arrive and you're on an absolute high, and then I had a technical problem. The problem there was twofold. We were up against weather. We had a very narrow window to get out across the Med, at which point we developed a technical problem, and I think the technical problem with the magneto, the ignition system, was caused by the aeroplane being outside for 2 nights in torrential rain. Up until then, hadn't had a problem, but it was battered by, high winds, torrential rain. We then got stuck for another week in this same system, and it was like being in a hurricane. And I don't think I slept for a week, and I was just deeply anxious about the aeroplane. We were all strung out. We were at a military airfield. The place was like a war zone. It was horrible, absolutely horrible. And we just wanted to get out.
Your passion and drive is palpable. What is it about flying on your own?
Sheer euphoria. Every time I took off, in fact, every time I saw the aeroplane, I could just feel my pulse quickening. In all the frustration, everything that you have to deal with on the ground, the minute I saw it and the minute I took off, I just had this sense of weightlessness and delight. And I'm watching, it's lovely just to fly low level. So what you see is spectacularly beautiful. You just get this perception of the world that you never see from the ground. This is the bird's eye view. This is the view of the gods, isn't it? And to move through it at low level in a machine like this it's probably the ultimate experience, and very few people have had it. But I find myself sort of looking at the landscape, the cloudscapes. The aeroplane itself is just glorious to look at. The wings just shimmering in this sort of, it's so beautiful. It's incredibly beautiful, and it's intoxicating.
What do you want to be known for?
Oof. There's a good question. I don't know, as an aviator. Someone who flies old aeroplanes. So there's a distinction. I don't think of myself as a pilot. And actually, when I read some of the accounts as well, that I had vast experience of, that's not true either. I've been flying a long time, but I don't fly commercially. I've never flown commercially. I had a commercial license and I did a few years instructing, but most of my flying is private flying, and it's this sort of old-fashioned romantic adventure flying. So yeah, that's I suppose what I will be known as, a lunatic.
Moving on to some of the experience that you did have, I know that a tragedy occurred while you were at the Luwa Reserve. Can you talk more about that?
This was probably the most heartrending thing I've ever seen in my life. And, I love the African animals, these wonderful, exotic, rare animals. And one of the places we visited was the famous Lewa Conservancy, which is just to the north of Mount Kenya. And it's been put on the map because of its sort of groundbreaking efforts in protecting the wildlife, particularly the endangered black rhino, which is indigenous to Eastern Africa. So I had a morning with these 3 baby rhinos. All the mothers had been poached and they were being hand-reared. So we did a bit of filming that morning, and they were like puppies. I mean, they're drinking milk, flopping over, playing in the mud. And they're quite sort of, arsey. They just come and give you a shunt, and they were just absolutely adorable. Well, that night, poachers struck in the reserve and slaughtered a female. She was actually pregnant. And I went to see the carcass, and they'd just filled it with 37 rounds from an AK-37. And so she tumbled down this steep gully, and then her face just dismembered, just slashed off. And, this is a 10-minute exercise, and in that 10 minutes they've wiped out generations of rhinos, because this is a breeding female. There's only a few hundred left, and of course purely to serve this Asian demand for rhino horn, which is like eating your own toe clippings basically. These medieval barbaric things, but it's just atrocious to see it. We're aware that it goes on, but to see what they're doing, they're robbing Africa of its resources. This is Africa's, this is what keeps it going. People come to see the animals. So it's a tragedy, but it's a disgrace as well. And I felt so moved to protest about it, frankly. And if I can help in any way, I will do, because I think it's just appalling what's happening, and they should be stopped. And it needs an international effort to stop it.
Who are the women that you talked about, the women that you visited in the groups in Africa?
I went to visit a group of on the Lewa. Again, it was on the Lewa Reserve, and they've been funded. It's this microfinance, and how this money is being made available to women. All of these women were solo parents, and they ranged from late teens, I suppose, to in their 50s, and all striving for independence and self-sufficiency. So they had applied for loans, and they had sort of working groups there. So they were running their own farms and land holdings and a few chickens and goats. And again, they had such a sense of pride and independence. And, so I just went to talk to them about their lives and how they were supporting themselves, really. And how it might be possible to inspire people like that with an adventure like mine, because it is about women, isn't it? It's about, and of course Mary Heath was a great pioneering figure in her day, but she cut a real figure as a sort of free, independent woman who was striving to achieve herself. So, she was a great role model for me, and I hope in some way, to inspire young African girls at striking out. And I think that's where flight becomes a great symbol of aspiration. It's not everybody's cup of tea to get into an old aeroplane and fly thousands of miles up a continent, but it translates to other things. Being your own person and trying to live your own life and achieve yourself.
You talk about the inspiration of those women in Africa and independence and change, and I'm sure it's not only from an independent personal perspective, but also much wider change. What would you perhaps say to someone, or if they want to make a change or maybe become independent or do something different, or that heartfelt passion that maybe hasn't had an opportunity?
Well, I think courage. I admire that quality when I see it, and you see it with these women in Africa. They're brave and they have great great courage. So I think with anybody, I just say you've got to just grasp the nettle and get on with it, frankly. And we all suffer from that. You know, fear is how you deal with fear in your life, and the fear of fear. And you know, and I've been awake nights worrying about, you know, agonising about the flight, and you know, but yeah, you can be overwhelmed by it, and it's never as bad as you think it is when you're out doing it. So yeah, I just say crack on with it, frankly.
And I suppose going back to that point, and the point you made earlier about just going out and doing it. Yeah, there's fear. There's all sorts of things that emotionally we can get blockages around. Is that what drives you? What else drives you along with that?
Well, you talk about fear, but you know, and the fear of doing things. But my fear is not doing things. And I thought, if I don't do this trip, I'm going to regret this for the rest of my life, because I had a couple of really low points in the 4 or 5 years that were the prelude to actually doing the flight. You know, and lots of things interfere with it. You know, it was the fundraising, the sort of, you know, it was a very, very complicated, long, arduous process getting to the starting line in Cape Town. But ultimately, it just came down to the fact, if I don't do this, I'm going to really regret this. I'm going to rack myself forever about this. So that's what I feared most, not doing it, actually.
You're an aviator with a great spirit of adventure. What are the next frontiers for you? We've talked about change in Africa, about the Lua Reserve. There's obviously the whole piece about aviation. What's next?
More aviating. I mean, I've got the perfect flying machine. I'd love to take it to India and go and do the Silk Road to Samarkand and China, and ultimately I'd like to take the Stearman back to America and go and fly the Grand Canyon and Route 66 and just go and have a celebration. In fact, I'd love to do that with Boeing. So that is perhaps the final challenge. So it's a 5-year plan for me, I think.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so very much, Tracey, for telling us your wonderful story, overcoming the adversity and the challenge. I think you're a huge inspiration to many people, and very humbling, very inspiring. Thank you so very much.
That's very kind of you to say so, but thank you. It's been a pleasure.